going to be live on YouTube. Here we go.
I
Click.
love that fisherman sweater.
It is.
And we're live. It is Tuesday, February 23rd, 2021, 5:20 p.m., but we are not nearly as late as that sounds because we are broadcasting at a special time today, 5:15, so we're only 5 minutes late, which is within the 8-minute definition of not late, which all people in all civilized cultures except me observe. I am compulsively on time, but not today. I am going to forego the monologue today, but not the dog shirt, because I have so many questions for our guest that I don't actually want to take up a lot of time beforehand. So I just want to say we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we are allowed to talk linguistics with John McWhorter, which is a great pleasure.
As if they're different. Yeah.
Well, you know, that's the slogan of the show. So
It's tongue in cheek, so to speak.
Actually, the name in lieu of fun was suggested by a Twitter wag when Kate and I were both just talking about doing this. We said, what should we call the show? And I tweeted that at Kate, and somebody tweeted back in lieu of fun, and it kind of stuck. And that was
it was also kind of an insult at us at the time.
Yes.
It was like no one would.
It's a good title, though.
But like,
I like
good. It's really perfect.
You know, we've done it every day except one since quarantine began. We are 7 days a week. 364 days a year.
Yeah. You're episode 332.
That's right.
Oh, I salute you. That's amazing.
So,
Wow.
I want to start where our last linguistics podcast ended, or it
Who'd you
actually
have on?
not ended. So the last time
her.
we did a linguistics podcast, we did a podcast with the great Lenny Soros, who does from Scotland the Scots word of the day, and is a wonderful
I'm
young
putting her
poet.
Twitter feed in the thing, but she is absolutely astounding. She's
And
a young linguistic study, like she studies dialects and linguistics in at St. Andrews right now.
It's getting to the point where I don't know a lot of the really younger ones, but no, she sounds interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's also
very young.
In her other life a poet and a sort of YouTube, Twitter phenom for explaining one word per day of Scots. And she made an impassioned case for it's terrific. It's informative.
She does a tremendous job using Twitter as like a medium for teaching. I don't know. There's something
one
prescient
should.
about it.
Yeah.
And she made an impassioned case for the linguistic independence of the Scots language. That is that we should, and this took me a little by surprise. She and I had talked about it earlier, but I had always thought of Scots as something that sort of like 200 years ago was clearly a separate language. There had been a kind of convergence with English, and it had reached a kind of critical mass at some point. I was really impressed with the case she made that we should sort of still think of it as a separate language. And so I guess I'm interested to start with you there. It's across the Atlantic. This is a highly contentious political question.
Oh yeah.
Here it is not. What's the best way for us to think about the relationship between Scots and English?
Yeah, it's a really rich subject because it comes down, as almost everything does that's really interesting, to a fuzzy zone. It's where do you draw the line? And so, for example, with Scots, I think it's fair to say that with a little training, you can learn to read it and know where you're going to mess up if you're going from English, so to speak. And you can get to the point where you're doing pretty darn well and you think to yourself, okay, this is a kind of English. But reading is very artificial. And I have seen online great YouTube segments where somebody is speaking Scots, and this is a person well recorded, up close, not speaking quickly, no slang, and it's like a radio station that's not quite tuned in. You're fine for one sentence, and then you don't know what they're saying the next sentence, and so I am hard pressed to say, well, goodness gracious, this is not English, this is Frisian. But then on the other hand, it's so different from English that you can't help thinking there ought to be a word for this. And so, yeah, and Scots did used to be more different. Scots is what happens when people who are speaking a certain something come across the channel. Some of them go north, some of them don't. Well, it's going to become a different speech variety in different places, and Scots is what happened up north. And it's been a long time. So I figure it's one of those things where is something a separate language? A lot of it is what the people say, how they feel about it. And to the extent that was, especially when you get into the slang, and the example is now aging, but trains the fact that that movie needed subtitles. If you're going beyond the boy bounce the red ball, that you could be in a bar in some parts of Scotland as, say, us, and really have no blessed idea what anybody's saying all night because there's no adjustment being made. There's an argument for it. Speech varieties differ in non-discrete degrees. Russian and Hungarian are clearly different languages. I'm going to get rid of this. Russian and Ukrainian are kind of like English and Scots. To me, from my distance, they look like variations on the same thing. It makes especially Ukrainians furious to be told that. And the truth is that
it makes Russians happy, actually.
That's often it does. I was sitting behind somebody who was reading some Ukrainian poetry about a year ago. And frankly, my reading Russian is pretty strong. And so I'm just sitting there kind of bored and I'm looking. And after about 5 minutes, I realized I keep looking and I have no idea what any of it says. I know it's Slavic and I could kind of guess this must be Ukrainian, but it was so different that it might as well have been a different language. And I thought, yeah, once you get beyond the boy bounces the red ball, if it's interesting language, yeah, this I can see why they think of it as. So it's non-discrete, but I think it's mostly what people say. You have to go by how people feel culturally about it.
So but in fact, people almost always feel culturally differently about it. So I don't know whether English and Scots are more similar than, say, Serbian and Croatian. But between 1946 and 1992, the government of Yugoslavia insisted this was one language, Serbo-Croatian, that could simply be written with two different alphabets. Mm-hmm. And then you have the breakup of Yugoslavia, and each component insists that it is actually a separate language. I don't know whether English and Scots are more similar and different than, say, Norwegian and Danish, but everybody seems to agree that Norwegian and Danish are separate languages. And similarly, I'm really confident that that Scots and English are closer than, say, Cantonese and Mandarin, and yet the Chinese government has a gross political insistence that those are merely dialects of a single language. Is the ultimate answer to all of these questions just a political judgment, or is there some objective criteria for when you're talking about dialects, when you're talking about language continua, and when you're talking about really separate languages?
I so wish that there were some formula that one could give, because I'm giving the answer that you have to go with what people say, despite the fact that there are cases where, in all of my arrogance, I'll say that people are speaking the same language. It's the same thing. They are so similar. There is so little difference in comprehension, except under unusual circumstances. But obviously, there's something political going on. And so, in terms of people who don't get mad about this, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, on the page, incredibly similar. In speech, Danish is different for various reasons. It takes some adjustment. But Norwegian and Swedish, as different languages, no. In God or whoever's up there, God's eyes, they're dialects of something called mainland Scandinavian. And you can ask, I have asked a Dane, actually, if you move for the rest of your life to Sweden, would you take a Berlitz course or Duolingo in Swedish, or would you just adjust? And she readily, oh no, you just adjust. Well, then it means it's the same language. It's simple as that. With I saw briefly over in the comments Czech and Slovak. I have encountered Czechs and Slovaks saying they speak separate languages, like standing in front of me. They were people who worked in an orchard in New Jersey. And I was asking them, what brought you guys here? And they didn't seem to understand why I was asking that question. So we started talking about language. And it's the same thing, but for rather obvious reasons, they prefer to think of themselves separate. And then you get the other extreme, which is Mandarin and Cantonese are like Italian and French. They're completely different languages. And yet I have heard intelligent, educated Chinese people saying, not so much Cantonese, but some of the other quote unquote dialects that are in between. They think of these completely different languages spoken in China as kinds of Mandarin because that's what you're taught. And culturally, they feel that way. And the writing system can handle any one of these dialects that are really separate languages. So really, it ends up being that what you call it is socio-political, despite the fact that after a drink or two, I think most people can say that there are some of these varieties that are so close that it's obvious that dialects of the same language are being called something different. But you have to be careful telling people that. People don't always want to hear that.
Well, it's also because language is, what you're basically saying is that language is political. Language is like political, and then it's about like, so naming something as a language or naming as a dialect has, cheers. Has like kind of these externalities that you can't completely understand. Like, so I went to go visit my relatives in Sweden. There was an unwed mother that got sent from Sweden, who was my great grandmother, who was pregnant, and got sent to the U.S. And like, this is literally part of our family tree is like mystery father. And then there's like she married someone like in America, but we have all.
Oh, she was fallen, right? Yeah.
And so she's all of this family back in Sweden. This was like how they dealt with it. But like I went back to visit my Swedish relatives, and really creepy to show up, by the way. It's like 3 generations removed from like, and speaking a different language from people, and they like kind of look like your grandfather. Like it's like very weird. But wow. We were having this conversation, and like we were riding with I guess they were like extended nephews or nieces or something. But we're riding with the kids in the car, and like one of the girls goes, she's like 12. She was like, well, why do we all learn to speak English in school? Like, why do we even speak Swedish? Like, why do we even bother speaking Swedish? This is like everyone in the world speaks English, Dad. Like, and all of the music we like is English. Like, why are we doing Swedish? And like, there was just kind of this super awkward moment, which I was kind of deferred of like, this is a political question. This is not like a functional question. This is not anything else. This is a question about culture and identity and all of these various things. So I'm actually curious. Like, I've always wondered how people who study linguistics draw the line between what they study and the cultures that they study and the politics of the cultures that they study.
Really, what I say in one of my books, The Power of Babel, that sounds so tacky that you're pushing your own books. But Power of Babel.
No. We have a question in the Q&A about The Power of Babel.
I've had it on my shelf for a long time. It got lost in a myriad of other books that I ordered. But I'm
looking at it now. That's my baby. That's my favorite of all of them.
Really?
And because I wrote it before I felt like anybody was looking over my shoulder, so it's pure me 20 years ago. But I wrote that dialects are all there is. That's how a linguist thinks of it. There are all these dialects that tend to shade into one another. Often the barrier between one language and another is not clear, and that's true of maybe 5 or 6 languages. Over in the comments, this is fun. People are talking about Savoyard in France.
We have the smartest audience.
Yeah. We call them the Greek chorus.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're very.
And they named themselves that.
They named themselves the Greek chorus.
They clearly know everything. And Savoyard is one stripe along a continuum of Romance varieties that none of us here have ever heard of. And really, they all shade into one another. Where does it begin? And that's what language is really like. Then some of those get put in the shop window, and that's what we know as French, Spanish, and Standard Italian, which is one of a great many things that are spoken on the peninsula of Italy, many of which are not remotely the same language. Sicilian is not a kind of Italian. Sicilian is its own thing, but it happens to be spoken in this place called Italy. Yeah, if you just kind of roll the dice
like
again.
Portuguese or something?
No, it's a lot like Southern dialects of Italian, but it's
And
nothing like that Italian
Sardinian
that we learn in
and
school.
and
You know,
Sardinian Italian is quite different from.
Sardinian is a whole, definitely a whole different language. But Sicily, if Sicily were a separate nation, nobody would have any question that it had its own separate language that would be taught in different books. That's what language is really like. And then you end up dealing with the politics, which kind of interfere. So, for example, even here in the United States, this is beginning to be a long time ago, but there was that Oakland Ebonics controversy in 1997. And a lot of that was based on the idea of, do black kids speak a different language? I don't think anybody really meant, are black kids speaking Hebrew? But the idea was, is black English different enough to require adjustment? And there was no straight answer to that question. One answer was, well, clearly everybody understands each other fairly well, but still there are differences. And so it was a very
How did it even
complicated
get
discussion.
named Ebonics?
But
by
isn't
the
that
way?
question?
That was an act.
Can I just interject here? I mean, isn't that a question with a right and wrong answer? I mean, AV has. You've made this argument 100 times in 100 different. I mean, it actually has different grammatical rules. It is mutually intelligible with standard English, but it is not standard English. And it is, in some ways, less complicated and in some ways more complicated than standard English grammar. It has a different set of, and its differences are quite old. Why is that? I mean, the question of whether people should be instructed in it in schools is obviously a political and policy question. But the idea that it has integrity as a language rather than just as bad English or like a variety of a sort of.
Have you? I mean, like, why? What is
sort
so
of,
bad also about calling it a dialect? And like, is that like a second-class citizen type like thing to call something a dialect rather than a language?
Yeah. But isn't it quite clear what it is, right? Like,
no, because it often isn't presented in a way that convinces people. First of all, dialect to many people means something that isn't a real language. And many people are under that impression, even educated people often think they're real languages, i.e. they're in writing, and Alice in Wonderland has been translated into them, and then everything else is just some dialect that probably has 500 words and doesn't have as much grammar. So a lot of people who are sticking up for Black English, especially beyond the tiny little world of linguists, didn't like the idea of it being called a dialect because it sounded like it wasn't real. Thus, the idea that Black English is really some African language with English words, because that sounded more legitimate than dialect. So everybody was working under the same misimpression. But as far as Black English goes, why it's so hard partly for people to understand that it's legitimate. I know that the standard answer on this is supposed to be because of racism against Black people, and that is part of it. But also, if somebody is presented with a list, here is a rule in this dialect. Instead of saying desk, you say des. Instead of saying she's my sister, you say she my sister. Instead of saying why didn't you call me, you say why you didn't call me. So it looks like this supposedly legitimate speech variety is all undoings of standard English. So a very well-intentioned person might be thinking, but it seems like it's just broken English. People don't talk enough about the fact that for every one of those things, you can come up with a way that Black English is more complicated. Many people will give you one way that it's more complicated, usually involving the habitual be. And so she be, as I see somebody here saying, she be drinking scotch on Tuesdays or something. But I think a smart person thinks to themselves, okay, that one thing, what else? You have to have a whole list. So to push another one of my books, Talking Back, Talking Black, I gave a whole list of ways that Black English is more complicated. Because if you don't give those, I think 4 out of 5 people aren't really convinced, even if they tell you that they are. So I think that's part of what is going on.
If you like literally translated in order, like certain like Romance languages, they would be like, I be,
yes.
Right? Like there's no doubt about it. Like je suis, like I be, like that is. I mean, that's literally what it is. And so
it's the way a language can be. Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
I'm hung up on an antecedent point though, which is if
I want to pivot to Noam Chomsky, Ben. So ask your question, then we're going to Noam.
If the rules were as simple as, English minus. Right? Like you cut out a bunch of the rules of standard English, then anybody who was proficient in the rules of standard English would be able to speak it. Right? there has to be additional complexity for it to be not easily mimicable by people who aren't either trained in it or more probably grew up speaking it.
Yeah.
I can mimic all kinds of things that simply, like, if you tell me leave out all the modifiers, I can leave out the modifiers.
Why? But right.
Right, but like if you tell me no verbs, okay, no verbs, I do that. I just failed to do that, actually.
It's actually pretty hard.
Okay, but the point is, if you tell me speak Black English, I can't do it, right? And that means there are positive rules that I can't do as well as negative rules, right? Mm-hmm. Am I missing something there?
No, you're not missing anything, but it isn't put that way often enough. And so, yeah, it's not just what you can leave out, and if you leave it out, you sound just like a Black person. There are things like you can leave out the verb to be, but not in the first person singular. A Martian would have trouble with that. There's no I, your friend. And yeah, any American knows nobody would say that. He, your friend, we, your friends, but not I, your friend. So that's a really persnickety little aspect of it. But it certainly doesn't sound that way to the layman. And if all the layman reads is that the verb to be is omissible in Black English, I think a lot of people feel like the wool is being pulled over their eyes. And so I think actually in this, I think I'm beginning the third act of my life, I am seriously considering writing a grammatical description of Black English that really focuses on explaining how it's elaborate, fierce, as I've been calling it lately. Because if you can't see it, I think a lot of people have trouble seeing the truth of it, especially because, let's face it, there is what we might call it's becoming fashionable to call it a caste system. I'm thinking of Isabel Wilkerson's book, but there is bias against Black people. And so already you've got that handicap. And I don't think that it's everything the way some people think, but it's there. You've got to really show that this thing is more. And, you know, the omissions are interesting, but then again, there are other dialects of English that omit things. So yeah, it's a whole argument, and I tried for it in the Talking Back book. And I think that book was fairly well received. I'm glad that it got around, but when we're talking about social media, I don't know if it's really about a book. It would have to, I'm getting an idea now. It would have to be podcasting. It would have to be Twitter. Yeah, that's the way you
should be in lieu of fun. Before you go to Noam Chomsky, I have to ask about one additional English language.
We're fighting for you.
Can't wait to see what this Noam Chomsky thing is going to be. But yeah,
it's like nothing. It's like not great.
I want to combine two of your interests that you have talked about on your podcast. One is Black English. The other is Gershwin, and this has come up in the chat. They come together. They come together in Gullah,
right.
And so,
man, you're good at whistling.
Oh man,
that's not fair.
That is that. You know, it is the piece of music that got me into opera as a teenager. It is just a truly incredible work, Porgy and Bess, and it reflects a real dialect, a real language. I don't know what to call it anymore. That is spoken by actual people in these outer islands of Georgia and South Carolina. And so somebody asked in the Greek chorus, what is Gullah? And I guess I would just add to that question, how faithfully do the Gershwins represent it in Porgy and Bess?
Very well. What they did was a kind of a Gullah light for purposes of comprehensibility. And that goes back to the play that Porgy and Bess was based on, which is just called Porgy, all but unreadable today, but written in that, and not because it's a bad thing, but because it's a potboiler melodrama, which, when it was produced, was done by the genius director Ruben Mamoulian, and was incredible stage pictures. If you read Porgy now, it's Porgy and Bess without the music. And you're kind of thinking, why was this such a big hit? And it's written in this Gullah light. If you see the pictures of what it was like and you read about it, it was a visual experience. But yes, as a language, very simple with Gullah. Gullah is Jamaican patois. basically, if you are going to be a lumper, which I am rather than a splitter, there is Jamaican patois, there is Guyanese, or creoles. These are these creole languages that you hear in the United States based on English that really can utterly wind you if you're trying to understand them spoken at speed. They're as different from standard English as Scots and probably a little bit more. Gullah is flavor of that was brought here from Barbados. There's a reason why Gullah speakers and Patois speakers can converse. That same language was then taken to West Africa, which is why Nigerians are often surprised that they can understand Jamaican Patois speakers. I don't know how many Nigerians have the occasion of sitting down and seeing Porgy and Bess, but they would find that the language was very familiar. So yeah, DuBose Hayward was this peculiar, sickly, I shouldn't mention that he was sickly, but he was this Charlestonian white person who was very much interested in Black culture. And he had taken in the speech variety. I am unaware of anything in Porgy and Bess or the play Porgy, with the Gullah is a little bit thicker, where it's wrong. Where it sounds bizarre to us, it's because people in Charleston and beyond speak basically a variety of Jamaican patois, but it isn't put that way in the United States often. But a certain one variety flowered and became different species in dozens of places around the world. So that's what that is. And it's always interesting to me because I think these people are bilingual, essentially. They speak standard English when they're in the schoolroom, then they speak this other thing, which might as well be a different language, and then they speak Black English in between. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Kate,
I mean,
we have come to the part where you get to ask about Noam Chomsky.
My brain is like going in all of these directions. So I come to this from like a cognitive science standpoint. Like, just I actually studied similarity judgment. And
Kate, can I interrupt you very briefly?
Yeah, of course.
Over there, they're talking about the Porgy and Bess movie.
Oh, yes, yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
It's held up. We're not going to see it.
Is this the one with Sidney Poitier?
Yeah, we're not going to see it anytime soon. I should say, folks, I have seen it screened with a good print in a theater. It's really not. It's not very good. Yeah, you would not be as interested in it. It's got a great soundtrack, and you can hear that. But the film itself, it's kind of like a high school play with very good looking actors.
Isn't that the feeling of all musicals when they get turned to film, that they feel like a high school play?
It's not Music Man. Not Music Man. Okay, some of them are actually good. Kate, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No. Ben interrupted me. Everyone interrupts me.
I love some musicals. Porgy and Bess is more ambitious.
No, of course it is. But that's a little bit like, no, I mean, I agree. So there is I've actually never had the opportunity to see Porgy and Bess at all. So I can't really speak to that, but I believe you, and I know I love a lot of the songs that come out of it, but I've just never seen the play totally like done because it's never been performed at or not the play, the opera totally performed. Like there's just never been it's never been done anywhere, and there is no kind of version of it that I feel like would do it justice. So you have
to be in New York or you're in England if it's not where you live. Yeah, it's hard to see the whole thing. It's available, the recordings now. It's very dense, and it's Wagnerian.
And it's long.
How did you?
Oh, it's like 400 hours long.
Can I ask you both how you initially came to hear it for the first time?
Oh man, I have such a terrible story about how I fell into the lap of Porgy and Bess.
I was Black, and my mother was somebody of the mid 20th century. Was Black, still am. My mother was.
I was gonna say, I was like.
I've changed.
This is awkward. Are you going to tell him, Ben?
I was a little Black kid, and now I'm a big Black kid. And my mother was a mid-20th century person who loved Porgy and Bess because it was very often done. Everybody saw the movie. So she would play the sound a lot when I was a kid, and the songs are so good. Then there was a production that the Houston Opera did, which was the first time the whole thing had been done in '76, and it came through Philadelphia.
That is a legendary performance. It's a gorgeous.
That's everybody's favorite recording of it. Yeah, so that's where I learned it. Because, you get the Houston Opera, and like my mother dragged me, and I didn't want to see this, and I was just stunned. And so I don't think I would care about Porgy and Bess if I weren't Black, because it was my mother doing something that people of her generation did, which was you go see Porgy and Bess. Yeah.
So I have a much less authentic, like legitimate answer to this question. So when I want to say I acknowledge that this answer is terrible. When I was a teenager, I saw a movie, a terrible movie, starring. It was the one effort that Baryshnikov made to do acting. I think it was called White Nights.
I remember that. Yeah,
it was a movie with Baryshnikov and Gregory Himes, and there is a scene in it in which Himes tap dances to "There's a boat that's leaving soon for New York, come with me," and the whole movie is a disaster. I mean, it's a terrible movie, and that song gnawed a hole in my brain, and I went and got that Houston Opera 76 recording, and
that really is what did it. Wow.
That is how I came to Porgy and Bess.
I love that.
And that recording of Porgy and Bess caused me to be interested more broadly in Verdi. And to sort of push back 40 years, 50 years. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to this terrible, terrible movie.
That was a real bad movie.
It's a really bad movie.
I remember
and it's basically unwatchable, except that there's this scene where Gregory Himes dances to Porgy and Bess. But John's point is a much more important one, which is that, if you go through Porgy and Bess and just listen to the number of themes in it that have become important jazz standards, like there are themes in it that you don't know are from Porgy and Bess. There are things you think are traditional hymns and spirituals that are actually not traditional spirituals. They're written in the 1930s by George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin. There are, like, the influence of the thematic content of that opera on American culture is really hard to overstate.
You know what you should do, actually? Don't start with 2 hours and 50 minutes of because honestly, that's a lot to take in at first. Start with Porgy and Bess, and don't do the Broadway revival from about 10 years ago where there's like a 3-piece orchestra. They just butchered it. What you need is find the movie soundtrack, because even though the movie itself is kind of a plop, they got great people to sing. It's what I was raised on. And that way they leave out, frankly, all the kind of boring opera parts where people are just talking to each other and saying pass the salt. That you can learn after you've got the basic 16 or 17 great tunes. So start with the movie, and that's pretty easy to get, the movie soundtrack. And then after a while, you can open up. That's how I learned Porgy and Bess. But it is some of the best music ever. Just amazing.
Yeah, totally.
All right, Noam Chomsky.
Yes.
No one fucking wants to talk about Noam Chomsky. We just
do.
I can't wait to know music. What it's going to be.
Like John is whistling, Ben is reminiscing. No one wants to hear about this.
Sang.
Yeah, I know. It was very lovely, Ben. No, okay, so one of the things that I find fascinating, and I don't actually love the Sapir-Whorf, even though it's misnamed and kind of a bullshit conception. Sorry, to those who are not familiar, it's basically two people who never wrote together, co-authoring a hypothesis. They didn't write, right? I'm right about this, right? Like they never wrote together, but they're named after a hypothesis that is it's very bizarre. I don't actually know the whole history of it, but all I know is the basic hypothesis that they stand for is that, like, how you talk and your language structure dictates, like, something about your cognitive abilities, whether that is actually biological in some way and reflects itself in, like, various parts of the brain that grow stronger or various parts of the brain that grow weaker. or whether like actually there's like actually I think that there's extensions of this that talk about how people talk being in the back of their mouth and the front of their mouth, and how it affects like their like how like it affects their like the shaping of their jaw, and like over time in like various
Missed
cultures.
that.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? No, I've heard like a bunch of people that like, oh, I when I was in France for a period of time, I was meeting with linguistic people who were studying the idea that like people in France like talk, and there was like an overbite kind of like characteristic that was more prevalent in France because of this. It was I also was like, what?
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
but it was kind of an interesting, it was like a weird extension of this. But my point is that basically like you've kind of discounted this idea before. I agree with it. This is some of kind of like what it was the idea was popularized in Arrival, the movie Arrival, which had to have been like a trip to watch. Kind of how I feel about The Social Network. I just like I study tech and law policy now, so I just like I'm not gonna watch that movie. That movie's just gonna make me mad. But like maybe you watched Arrival and felt okay about it, but like. I just kind of like wanted to like spitball for a second about kind of the idea that you're doing all of this work, and how do you draw the line between language is written, language is spoken, and then like this realm of, as you said before, I don't know, I don't think we're a public yet, but like as we said before, the idea that language is in some way biological and impacts, like that there is a part of neuroplasticity that language plays a part in, and how I don't know how you even decide what you're going to cabin your studies to.
Yeah, that's a large question, and it's my job to give a coherent, relatively.
No, you can just like answer one small part of it or ignore it all. Sorry.
No, the Chomskyan idea is that we're born with this rather elaborate capacity for syntactic structure in our brains. And it's a fascinating idea that only a genius could have come up with. And after about 60 years, the sad truth about it is that if you ask the people who study that kind of thing, what have you got? Like you're talking about this universal grammar, you've been doing this since roughly before I was born, 1965. What have you got? And there is an alarming lack of consensus, and maybe that marks it as a young science, but if you look at the schema that these people have for how we generate language, it's this hydra-headed thing that looks suspiciously like the way computers are programmed, and I'm not sure that it works. And the people who do it are some of the smartest people I've ever known. And if I were them, I wouldn't give up my paradigm. But I think that gradually a wheel is turning, and the idea that what we do is we're born with this computer program in our heads where language is generated in ways that have nothing to do with what any of us would intuit language was, even if we were anthropologists or psychologists. I don't think it goes through. I think that language is more based on starting with words' meanings and putting them together in a way that is much less elaborate than what the Chomskyans call syntax. And I think that we tend to lose sight, you talk about plasticity, of how plastic the human brain is, such that we can do this complicated thing we're doing now with our mental equipment that was designed to do things like watch out for leopards and especially interact with one another, that we know that we wish to communicate messages to one another. With other animals, what they communicate to one another is roughly sex, aggression, food. That's something. But the idea that you want to say more than that, that's what makes human language. A lot of that. But the idea that what you need in order to do what we're doing is what they come up with, I honestly think, and one has to be careful with this because they've come up with an extremely elaborate jargon, an extremely elaborate mechanism. When you say you don't agree with it, you're subject to the charge, justifiably, that you just don't understand the details. But quite honestly, if you do, you still might come out thinking, no, all of this isn't needed. And you may be interested in other complex versions of how syntax work that aren't those. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to foot stomp that and say that, like, basically, after studying cognitive science and neuroscience for X number of years, like 4 or 5 years, and then going to law school, and then going and doing my PhD in law, and I went off to study kind of like an intersection of cognitive science and intellectual property at the time. My general conception of all of this was that like that there's this weird line that gets drawn at biology, in which we decide that this biological, like, we can see some blood flowing in this area in this fMRI that we have done, and so we have thus decided that this is the essential, like, and there is, it just, like,
the territory.
but yes, but it just doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you have more blood flow to that area, but like, that doesn't answer what is being done with that, what is happening. None of these, like, all of these various things. We have vague definitions in various parts of the brain, but it all seems like a very false kind of answer of a punting of various types of intent, of like being able to discern intent from an fMRI, or discern intent, or like to discern like linguistic motivation from an MRI. And like, all of this just seems to me to just be another area of interpretation functionally. And so like, that's kind of what struck me about like kind of following this down.
The Sapir-Whorf part really comes down to something pretty simple. The idea that your language channels your thoughts, and that by extension, the structures of your language create what your cultural perspective is. God, you want that to be true. I remember first hearing it when I was an undergrad.
I know, it sounds really great.
Yeah, Hopi,
you're like,
Hopi
you
doesn't
solved
have
every
any
criminal
markings.
Case ever.
Yeah, no tense marking in the Hopi language, and they also have a cyclical sense of time. I remember 1985 learning that and thinking, this is why I'm in school. You're like, you want that. And then it just turns out to not be true. And I wrote a thing, and I'm going to show it. I'm allowed to push. This is The Language Hoax, and yeah, that's kind of a come-on title, but the idea was that you're always reading in the media about this sort of thing. And it comes down to, it's very simple, very, very easy. It's really about 10 pages of the language hoax, and it's all you need. If your language channels your thought, then we have to consider that in Mandarin, if you say, you see my sister, you know she's pregnant, that's the way that you would, my sister, you have known she was pregnant. There's no way in colloquial Mandarin to be as specific as if you had seen my sister, you would have known she was pregnant. That's a very European language way of putting things. That business of the counterfactual, the languages we're most familiar with, really emphasize that. In many other languages, a lot of that is left to context. Mandarin is one of them. Now, suppose you did an experiment where you decided to show that speakers of Mandarin aren't as efficient at processing the counterfactual as we are, because their language doesn't prime them to do it. Suppose that's been shown in some experiments. They're very hard to knock down. Do you want to go from that Mandarin shapes a worldview, if the worldview isn't something cool, like the Hopi Native Americans being more sensitive to the difference between water cooking in a pot and water in a lake, where you think, well, we're just so numb and insensitive. But it's something like sensitivity to the counterfactual, which really is another way of saying our Mandarin is not quite as quick on the uptake as the rest of us. And immediately you reject it. You say the experiments must have nothing to do with the personhood. The language just happens to not emphasize that. There is a major disconnect between what your grammar happens to obsess with and what you process in the world. Well, if that's the verdict on Mandarin, that's the verdict on the whole hypothesis. And
I love
that's it. And so Arrival was wonderful. I loved Arrival.
You liked Arrival?
Great entertainment. But I remember sitting there around the middle of it and thinking, oh, good God, is this what it's going to be? Because I wasn't fine. And I remember thinking, now everybody's going to believe this. It was ridiculous. You know, anything Amy Adams does, it works. Yeah. She's a very intelligent actor. But no, it was an absurd movie.
She's a very intelligent actor, but she's very pretty. And it's like she moves things and does things.
Well, I'm not going to say that. She is. But she's also she's a very intelligent actor, too.
Yeah, I know.
So I love everything she does. But no, the movie's message was absurd.
Yeah, I agree.
Colleen, the floor is yours. We have a lot of questions today, so we'll try to get through a bunch of them.
Yeah,
Colleen,
well,
you get the first one.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing me on. I really love your podcast, Lexicon Valley.
Thank you.
And one of the great things about it is all the wonderful clips that you have to illustrate the points. So I just wanted to ask you how, tell us how you choose those clips. How do you find them?
The clips are the last thing. And so I plan what I want to say, and then I think, well, it's a podcast, I have to have clips. And I think, well, what would be the cute illustration of this? And it ends up being about 1/3 of putting it all together. And the idea is just to try to be a podcast. It's funny, I don't listen to the show, but I can imagine if I went from the beginning, I would see that I've been learning this language that you have to learn, where you have to illustrate something by playing clips. And luckily, the podcast medium is such that you don't have to pay for the rights. So I just kind of go to town, and that's how I choose the clips. And often, the fun thing about Lexicon Valley is that the audience allows me to get away with something as random as I'm sitting here talking about language and grammar, and then I get to play some obscure musical theater song that has nothing to do with it, and everybody knows it has nothing to do with it, and yet that's allowed. And so now it's both clips, and it's me thinking, what musical did I listen to last week where I can kind of jimmy it into it? And somehow people allow that incoherence, and I hope they keep allowing it.
All right, Windsor Man. This is a day on the show where a lot of the questions are coming from former guests. Windsor Man, the floor is yours. Except you're frozen.
Hi, Professor McWhorter. We actually emailed me before, but I have a question. Am I still frozen?
Nope, you're good now.
Can you see me or hear me? Okay.
We can do both.
2 years ago, you were on a 2 years ago, you were on a panel with Stanley Fish. I don't know if you remember this, but it's been on my mind. He said that Orwell's Politics in the English Language was silly and awful, and you sort of winced but didn't say anything. And I'm just wondering what if you remember that and why, and what you think of the essay, and what you think of Fish's view of it.
Yeah. Was this in Wales or was it in downtown Manhattan?
Whoa, I've lost Windsor, which makes it hard to do the follow-up question. I'm bringing him back.
I sincerely don't remember the moment.
I'm laughing only because I know Stanley Fish, but go ahead, Windsor.
I've appeared with him twice. It was a couple of years ago. I think you mean Wales, right? We were in Wales.
2019. I pulled up the website. The Limits of Thought.
This is embarrassing.
No, it's fine. I do this all the time. No one could tell me the title of my talk and make me understand
the Institute
where I was
of Art
in time.
Ideas.
It would have to be like this. Where was I physically?
I think this was. Boy, they run together. I did an event with him in downtown Manhattan in what would have been, I mean, especially lately with everything running together, that would have been in late 19. Okay, yeah. If I winced then, it was because I sensed he doesn't like that. What did he say about it? Do you remember?
I think he said it was silly and awful. He really didn't like it. He made it clear. He thought it's clearly a kind of a cliche essay. Everyone brings it up. So I kind of get that, but he didn't like the substance of it. And
Windsor, I hate to say that I don't remember what the flow of the argument was, and I haven't talked about that essay with him off stage, but if he was hating it and I winced, it would have been because I would have thought that the essay had some valuable insights for our times in terms of there is a relationship between language and thought, which I also say in the language hoax. And so language can help nudge new ideas along, and one can use language in ways that discourage you from thinking about aspects of it. And if he thought that was simply not true and that Orwell was off his nut, I can imagine wincing while he was talking and not knowing I was being seen. I wish I could be more specific than that.
I make faces all the time. I do them even on live.
Even on In Lieu of Fun.
Yeah, I know. Hi,
Alice. The floor is yours.
Hi, I've been listening to you since back when you were on Blogging Heads. So
I'm still on it. Yeah.
my so I'm a elementary school teacher, and I started over switching to education when Embonics broke, and I was over in Oakland, so that was really exciting. And fortunately, I started my credential program a couple of years later at San Francisco State, and being kind of at the cutting edge of things, they did go over and cover a lot of that over in my classes, because I had to be prepared to go over and teach English learners. And so they also melded in being culturally competent about going over and teaching non-standard English speakers of various sorts, and specifically focused on Ebonics and AAVE. Where do you see things going since then? Because it seems like it's more accepted by the general public after a lot of years. And how's it seen over in academia? Because it touches, I mean, it's a linguistics thing, but obviously it's affected education quite a bit.
Well, it's a funny thing. I think that since 1996, this thing we now call Ebonics has definitely achieved a pride of place in the culture that was unimaginable back then. It's no longer seen as the complete bastard that it was then. The case that there's something to it no longer surprises a critical mass of people. I don't think we're all the way there yet, but something did happen in the wake of that. But in terms of education, the idea, which I did not agree with at the time, that the problems that a lot of Black students have in school when they're young is because of the difference between the dialect of Black people and the mainstream dialect. That idea is one that I don't think holds up enough to justify changing public policy. And there have continued to be people doing short-term but substantial experiments showing that if you give Black students, say Black English readers or the like, that at least for a time they do somewhat better in learning how to read. And that's good to know. But for me, the larger issue, and I've never really posed it in a piece or in public, I've never pushed this that hard about a response to the Ebonics controversy, is that we've known how to teach poor kids or kids from bookless homes how to read since the 1960s. There is Siegfried Engelmann's program. He has come up with a way of teaching kids how to read that's based on phonics as opposed to the whole word. There's a book called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons, which I've used for both of my children. It works great. And of course, I live in a book-lined home. But this is designed for people who, don't live in a book-lined home. And that does it. And it works.
My brother learned to read that way.
Yeah. And it works for Black kids, white kids, poor kids, middle-class kids. We've known. And so the idea that you need to have these Ebonics readers, I get where that comes from, but it really isn't necessary. We know how to teach kids who are starting from behind how to read. I have seen that basic reality make no purchase among the people who study this academically at all. I should also say, though, that I don't follow closely their work at this point, not deliberately, but just because, life goes on and you pay attention to other things. But I do wish I saw more evidence that that was fully acknowledged, because it would help poor kids, and especially Black kids, read better and more quickly.
Len, we talked about you at the beginning of the episode, and here you are, joining us from Scotland.
Hello.
Oh.
This is Len. This is the magic of the internet.
It is. That's right. Hi.
Len, I actually
thought my ears were burning.
I saw my ears were burning. I was like, Len, I was actually thinking, I listened like a number of times to your Scots word of the day for cry versus greet. And I still do not understand how you use cry, like even in context, versus, sorry, you probably have probably have a question for John, but I'm just gonna say, like, I just don't understand, like, these. I'm like, greet is cry, and then cry is not cry. It's like something else. It's like a whole nother thing.
So when you're emotional and you cry, you're greeting. So the verb to cry in English in Scots is to greet. to cry in Scots is to call something something. So, what do you cry your wains? Oh, that wifey on the telly. What do you cry her? What do you cry that thing that lights up the room? Oh, it's a light bulb. Do you know what I mean?
Oh.
So to cry is to call or to name something.
Oh, to
Whereas
names. Oh, the light bulb
you-
thing
if you want-
finally like
right.
kind of gave it for me.
As in
Thank
a
you.
town crier.
light bulb
I
moment
get
for
it.
you there.
There you go.
Oh no, that's
Yeah, because
so,
if you
that's,
think about it, in any language that you're learning as a second language, think how late it is before you learn how to say, she called me a dirty name. It's not going to be the word for call, it's going to be something else. That's an example of that. Yeah. In French, it's traité, which is not what you're expecting. Okay, so in Scots, it's cry. That's neat.
Aye.
yeah.
What about home and hame? Talk about home and
Hame,
hame.
I mean, home and hame, I mean, the Scots word for home would be hame, but that's just because of the sort of differential, the vowel shift thing.
So a hame isn't a different concept? Like warmer or something like that?
Well, as that, a load of Scots words are warmer by definition. Like a bosey to me feels warmer than a hug. Currying in has absolutely no. A bosey, aye, that's the Doric word for a cuddle. A gansey is warmer than a jumper or a sweater. I'm going Scots English, American English. Or
No, you're doing
currying
amazing
in.
work, Glenn.
The concept of currying in, you can't curry in any other language. It's something that only exists to me in a Scots context because there's no English equivalent. But that my question was just about Scots anyway, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Go for it.
I think there's massive lag. Oh, my question was just Scots has no standardized orthography. It's a massive debate in the community, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on how integral a standardized orthography is to a language, because we've got a Queenie debates going on at the minute about whether Scots is a language or not, and obviously it's political, it's socio-political, so I wanted to know what your thoughts were and whether that's a reason to discredit it as a language.
I think it's pretty important to come up with, this is just me, to come up with an agreed upon orthography, partly, and also an orthography that maybe stresses differences from standard English, because it'll make the layman more open to the idea that it's something different and legitimate at the same time, because that can be a hard argument to make to busy people who, have no reason to think about it very hard. But there should be one orthography so that there isn't the opportunity for people to say there isn't even a way to spell this. It's inexact. It's just wild. If there's one way, then that to the layman seems more like, quote unquote, a real language. And so it's important. I really do think it's important to cater to an extent to what people are thinking who have no reason to spend that much time musing on these things. You have to think about what real life is like. And so, yeah, I would say have an orthography. Haitian Creole now has an official orthography. Jamaicans are now using an orthography that stresses, making it look as little like standard English as possible. And I think it's very effective. So I imagine, who am I to tell Scots what they should do about their speech? But my sense is that to imitate the Jamaicans would be a good idea. Yeah.
Oh
All
my
right.
gosh.
Let's get through 2 more questions and then
This
wrap.
is so fun. Sorry.
Andy, backlit like Daniel Burge. The floor is yours.
Yeah, Andy, are you looking at like a hostage capture
You've
video?
definitely got the Daniel. You've got to be on your with a shirt with the same color as your couch, though, to do the perfect Daniel imitation.
Yeah, you are blending in. Okay.
Hi, Professor. One of my biggest regrets was not taking your course when I was in college, so this is awesome to ask a question. What is the origin of the word woke, and how did it evolve into its current use today in the Great Awakening? And have your views on it and the kind of culture surrounding it evolved since 2014? I'm guessing they have, because I've heard your podcast. But
boy, has that word evolved quickly. Woke starts in probably the 40s, but it's first documented in the 60s. It's a hip, black, cigarette-smoking street word. And what it means is that you are hip to what the man is doing to us, that you have a good, solid liberal / leftist politics about what's really going on. So it goes back that far. It never really jumped the rail. And then what happens in the 2000 teens in particular is that the word is revivified and it becomes a mainstream word. And for about 10 minutes, what it just meant was that you are aware of the operations of society in a way that many people left of center think of as integral to being educated or awakened. It substituted for PC, which had become worn out by being used as the term of abuse. You're too PC, and after a while, people who are PC don't want to admit being it. Woke very nicely replaced that. But I think because of social media, the nature of it, and I think partly because of the unique polarization of our times, probably partly because of Donald Trump, woke starts as meaning that and still did as late as, say, 2015. Whereas now, it is a term of abuse already. We see much longer to reach that point. But I think that the fact that we can all do this, and maybe partly that we've all been doing this so much more since last March, has taken that word and transformed it into what is now practically a slur. I'm having to work to remember that woke still had a nice shine on it when I talked about it on, for example, Colbert, which was like 4 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. I do remember the Colbert thing, and I actually do specifically remember being like, that is not yet my understanding of that word. Like, I remember like very deeply having not registered, like memeified in that way. And the same with like a bunch of different things that are slurs. Like, I didn't understand that snowflake was it. Like, I hadn't, like, there was like a whole bunch of things that like I had never like realized were slurs, and like I was like, oh, okay. So but that's such a part of language, and like the fact that we are like kind of in dialogue with each other, and you have no way of knowing that from like reading news. It's purely a social and cultural construct and like use. There's no other way.
David Botts, you get the last question today, but as always, we need an explanation of your background.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Ben, for bringing me on. We've got the insect of the day, beast of the day, and we've got that's
a screenshot of mine from John McPhee from his book The Encounters with the Archdruid that I posted on Twitter.
Oh wow!
Thank
Excellent.
you. Yeah,
Excellent.
sorry. John McPhee wrote me a letter, and I've very touched, or an email, and I was, and it was like very touching and nice, and I cried a lot yesterday like, after I got it.
David, you get the last question today.
Okay, I will tighten it up. Well, first, thank you, Professor McWhorter. This is super interesting. What are your thoughts about Mike Pesca's suspension, and how does this event promote or inhibit conversation and debate, particularly around racially charged subjects?
Leaving it with an easy question.
Oh, I know what I think, but it's delicate because it happened 48 hours ago, and I too do a Slate podcast. And so it's just...
I've been on the Gist. Ben's been on the Gist. We're like, Mike's been on the show.
I've hosted the Gist.
And Mike has been many times on In Lieu of Fun.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. Yeah, he must have been very good. I do not agree with that decision. I have argued in many places that within reason, the N-word should be able to be used in full when you're referring to it. And I say that not in the sense that I wish that were the way it would be when it never has, but because I'm now old enough that I remember in the 90s and into the 2000s that was considered okay. You didn't say it over and over again, but you could say, we're going to have a conversation about, and notice even I can't do it now.
I was just gonna say, I was like actually kind of prepping for you saying it, and I'm like, I feel like this.
Back in like 2002, a white person could do that in polite company, and very often nobody flinched, and I think that was fine. But we've developed this unique taboo against it, especially over about the past 7 or 8 years, and I think that it's unnecessary. And I should say, Ta-Nehisi Coates, with whom I have a great many disagreements on just about everything, he agrees. He wrote about this back in 2013, and he said this idea of never saying the word at all, even to refer to it, doesn't work. Now, if Ta-Nehisi Coates believes it, that shows that this isn't me being the weird black contrarian. And so, yeah, Mike repeatedly brought
That's
up...
what I think of you as, by the way.
It's going to be on my tombstone.
Yes.
But weird. But yeah, Pesca brought it up again and again. And that annoyed some people. But I do know that, 5 or 6 years ago, he would have been reprimanded. I know that 2 or 3 years ago, he would have been reprimanded for that. We could have a conversation about whether he should have been. For him to be essentially fired, I don't agree. And I've made it very clear in many things I've written in a great many places. I've even said it on my own Lexicon Valley. And as I said on Twitter, I'm still processing because I'm so hurt for Mike. I'm so frightened of our times in general, because as we all know, what happened to Mike is now symptomatic of something that seems to happen to somebody every 2 weeks. And I'm still working my way through what my response to that is going to be. And we're here in this day. Mike told me about this 2 nights ago before it broke in the news, and I'm still working on where one goes when that happens.
Yeah,
And that's
about
as much as I think I can say on this night. Yeah.
I was supposed to record a Just podcast for tonight, or tonight. Like I was supposed to. Yeah, I know, and it got canceled, and I was like, "Why? Oh well, whatever." And then I was like, "Ugh." It was so sad.
Well, we are certainly going to give you space and not demand your response before you're ready to give it. I will just say, I think Mike Pesca is all and the best podcaster in America, bar none. I think he is a remarkably diverse and interesting mind, and without getting into the merits of things that were discussed in Slack and Slate and what I may think of them, I think his contribution to podcasting has been hard to overstate the importance of what the Gist has been and what he's done with it. And I just, want to, I didn't mean for the conversation to take a Mike Pesca turn, though I guess given words and given
we're all thinking about it. Yeah, let's face it.
I do think
I'm not thinking about it. I barely made it out of my property class. I'm I walked straight into this, and then I was like, a glass of wine. That's what I need. And then I found out that this whole Mike Pesca thing had happened. But okay, yes.
Lord.
We're gonna leave it there. John McWhorter, you're a great American, and it is fabulous to meet you finally.
My gosh, will you come back? Please come back.
Would you please have me back?
Yes, and then we're going to talk, and then I'm going to make you talk about Tversky and Kahneman, and we're going to talk about Medine, and we're going to talk about
there are about 6,000 languages that we have not yet discussed.
That we haven't talked about.
Languages that we haven't talked about.
We haven't talked about any.
We can talk about Carmen Jones.
And
there's about all sorts of things.
And there was a great discussion in the
Carmen in Black English, written by Oscar Hammerstein.
Oh. And there was a great. And there was a great suggestion in response to Len's question in the chat that we do a whole show about writing systems.
Whoa! I'm doing a great courses set on writing systems this summer, so I'm going to be thinking about that.
Yeah, so
I'm doing the whole thing. That's going to be on my mind.
Have you back early and often? We do this
daily.
It's 364 days a year. We missed a day the other day because my internet at my cabin in the woods went out. We will be back.
One out every 2 weeks. Huh. Wow.
So Kate, who's our guest tomorrow?
Jack Balkin is from Yale Law School, is going to be coming on to talk about tech and free speech. Then we have on Thursday
every day.
Yes,
7 days a week.
Katie Engelhart, who's going to be talking about her book on dying and chronicling the lives of the dying, called The Inevitable, in which you wrote
cheerful subject.
But it's like Katie is amazing and like she's fun at parties. You'd be surprised. Like she's really good. And then we have Richard John at Columbia. Do you know Richard? Like maybe you know him. Richard is communications and he is a scholar of the Postal Service and wrote the history of the Postal Service and now writes a history of communications, and he's going to come on and talk about how he thinks that he has a new strategy for how to think of social media within communications.
All of that will start 22 hours and 30 minutes from now.
Yeah, you've got your work cut out for you. Math.
Yeah, I did it. I did it. The mental math on the spot, despite the 15-minute lag. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But we have multiple language families, multiple languages within language families, language spectrums within those where you can't even tell where one starts, dialects that we can't decide whether they're languages or dialects, and we have all of that shit, and it's only getting more interesting. So,
yes,
that's where we are. We will see you tomorrow. Great to see you, John.
John McWhorter.